Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatirons Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatironstuning.com and stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.
Okay, so welcome back, everybody. This is episode number 46 of the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. So we've got Nigel here with us in the shop. Jeanette from Red Queen Racing is joining us at a different location. And we have another special guest joining us for this episode, and that is Farah Nanji. So welcome, Farah. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So Farah, I'm really looking forward to talking to you. You have, it looks like you've had a really interesting path to cars and motorsports and driving. You have a full career as a successful musician, as a DJ, but you also like or have found driving in motorsports. And so a number of years ago, I think it was back in 2011, you founded something called Regents Racing, where basically doing driving events, motorsports events, that sort of thing. And now you are a host, a fellow podcast host. You have your own podcast called Mission Makers, where you have taken the music side and the motorsports and driving side and a business side of basically kind of and melded all of these things, all of these interests together. And so you've created some really interesting episodes with various different people from the motorsports community, from the music community, and the business community. And so really looking forward to sitting down with you and kind of talking through your path to get to that point and just pick your brain on a number of things.
For sure. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you about a whole host of things. And thank you again for having me today.
Yes, of course. Well, and so the first question that I have for you is, which did you find first? Which pull did you have? Were you pulled into the music genre or into motorsports and driving first?
It's a great question. And I would say both of them stemmed from childhood, but music came first for me. I discovered the Spanish guitar at the age of 7. And it sort of became my escape from a very sort of pressurized and difficult sort of world that I found myself in at the time. And I really sort of, kind of gravitated towards this sort of healing power of music. And motorsports came a little later on. I was around 12 when I got into a go-kart. And so that's when I really, I think anyone who's been in a go-kart and loves it, it's sort of like a out of body experience. And I got hooked quite quickly on once I started karting. But I will say that my grandfather was a huge lover of cars. And we were lucky enough to have a classic car at home. So Sundays were, very much our bonding thing. And I think motorsports on a Sunday is quite, it is a bonding thing for families that sort of like, motorsports. Nothing like watching a race or going for a lovely drive in the countryside or something. And so that's what we used to do. So yeah, but I would say competitively, karting came around that age of 12.
Okay. Well, and karting is the perfect place to start at 12. I mean, that's I think it's probably just about the right age where you can really kind of fully appreciate it and decide if you like it and decide if you really want to put energy in that direction. And it sounds like you did. So how far along did you make it with karts, and when was there a point where you decided that the karting just, I don't know, you wanted something different, or you transitioned away from that?
Yeah, for sure. I'd actually say that 12, although there have been successful drivers who've started at that age, I like a lot of people that were in sort of my peers and particularly when you look at Formula One and stuff like that, these guys start 5 or 6. So I did feel like I found it a little bit late. However, I absolutely loved it. And first I started just kind of, doing what competing at the track and kind of just progressing through the different karts that they had there at the time. And then, sort of started getting my hands on some twin strokes and then Rotax. And the car, we're really lucky in the UK because, we've had so many Formula One drivers come from here. Every sort of county almost has its own racetrack or karting track, and they're maintained really, really well. So where I was karting, that was kind of where Lewis Hamilton, kind of honed his skills, Jenson Button. So, they take it really seriously, and they have a lot of programs in place for sort of different high level karts to kind of come through. So then, progress into Rotax and I suppose, when you get to that sort of teenage year of like 14, 15, is when you could sort of start going down the path of Formula 3 and single seaters and stuff. So I did sort of I did have a couple of test days where I was lucky to kind of drive that. But at that time, my story kind of became a bit complicated because I got diagnosed with this learning difficulty, and that learning difficulty actually had a huge impact on my motor coordination, because it was like a delay between my brain sending signals to the rest of my body when it came to motor skills. So I realized that, a career in this as a driver, like, although I was definitely, I was getting a few podiums, and I know that I had a natural skill set for it, but I knew that, like, to make it to the absolute, pinnacle of our sport, it's probably not going to happen. So I had to kind of like, I faced quite a difficult decision at that point, because I had to sort of focus on my studies, as a lot of people do at that age. But I knew that this was a part of me, and I somehow found my way back to it, just in a very different way.
Sure. Well, and that must have been an initial, a pretty difficult blow to find out that maybe that there was going to be this extra obstacle that you would be facing if you wanted to try and continue to progress. But it's great to hear that you've kind of worked through that. Would you say that, because you said with music that it was more from you found it, and it sounds like it was just a really enjoyable experience. What was driving and karting primarily an enjoyable experience too, or like if you're trying to progress and move forward in that way, was there more intensity to when you're going to the track? It sounds like if it's the karting and stuff is taken that seriously everywhere, that there's maybe a little bit more riding on a day to the go-kart track versus like listening or playing to music.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's a great question. Both of them really, for me personally, before it all became sort of a professional thing, both of them for me were sort of way of healing. I was kind of bullied in school, so I found nothing better than really listening to music, and also karting, because when you put your helmet on, nobody knows who you are. You're out of your surroundings. You're with people who kind of like the same thing. I was a tomboy. I was at an all-girls school, so playing football, cricket, karting, these weren't the type of things that, my classmates were doing. But for sure, I think I just found the whole thing fascinating, and I love peak performance. And I think that's your first taste of like literally being data obsessed and trying to find ways to just, cut down that split second. And I really like that whole aspect of it, because it was just a way of like pushing yourself to the limit. And in that sort of half an hour or 1 hour race, it wasn't about anything else but that. And yeah, so that's what I really loved about it. So, I mean, of course, music, it's not easy to learn an instrument, of course, but maybe the pressures aren't there so much because you're not at that age. I wasn't performing and, all of that stuff. So, yeah.
Well, and so let's, I guess if you're okay with it, talk a little bit about the learning disability that you were diagnosed with, and just kind of what you initially started to see that you were kind of dealing with, and just kind of how you worked through that.
Yeah, I was very surprised. Like, I didn't see that coming at all. And it was kind of like I was at this school that was basically top 10 in the country at the time, in England, and essentially like all the girls, they were like being not programmed, but like the expectations for them was Oxford or Cambridge. Like that was it. And for me, like the expressive subjects, I was very good at those, English, RS, history, things like that. But when it came to maths and science, I was really bad at it. And my teachers were quite surprised because, to get into the school, like you can't be getting C's. It's just not normal. You've got to be sort of a B is like really bad, but like, you can still kind of, maybe you're going through something, let's put it that way. But, I wasn't even, getting close to that. So obviously they were getting quite concerned, particularly as the kind of we have GCSEs here in the UK. So as that sort of started coming, and that when you start your GCSEs, that's like, your first step onto the professional ladder. Like that's going to go on your CV. Your grades are really important. It obviously reflects a lot about you and the way your work ethic is. So they kind of just said to me, like, look, we think you could do some extra time. Maybe it will help you out. So do you want to basically go to an educational psychologist and see like if there's anything that, you can get, kind of thing. So I went, and it's just like a 1-day test, and they did like all these different types of tests, and some of them were as simple as drawing a straight line like 10 times. And throughout the day, basically towards the end, the psychologist basically said, it's very clear that you've got dyspraxia, because we can see this kind of imbalance, like even drawing that straight line after you've done it a couple of times, like it doesn't stay straight. And then things started to click a little bit, because I realized, for example, design technology, like I love that subject, but I could just never cut in a straight line. Like I just couldn't. I don't know why. It was always really bizarre. And then things started kind of making sense a lot. And she said to me at that time, like, you've basically been rewiring your brain to like stay up with this incredibly intense educational system. Because for me, failure was not an option. Like I definitely could not be chucked out of school. Like, this would be such a huge shame to my family, and for everything that they invested in me. Like, I had to do well. So I just found different ways for me to make it work. But obviously it was relieving to know that actually, there was something going on underneath it. And I think, in terms of like, how did I process it afterwards? To be honest, at that age, I didn't really, there wasn't much support at that age, to be at that time, let's say. Maybe things are different now, but at that time, we're talking sort of over 15 years ago, these kind of things weren't really detected as much. And having gone much deeper into my diagnosis, I now know that children can be diagnosed with this quite early on. The signs can be there from literally when a child starts to walk and talk and, these types of things. But I was really lucky to do a TED Talk a few years ago. And when I was thinking about the subject of the TED Talk, it kind of hit me that basically for 15 years, I never really thought about the fact that I had this problem. I just kind of went ahead and did it because I knew that innately I love music. And I knew innately I love driving, and whatever happened, like I was going to forge a career in that somehow. But when I did the TED Talk, and I talked about how I sort of, let's say, rewired, some of these processes, that really got me a lot deeper into what was actually going on, with the brain. And I suddenly, took a step back and I was like, wow, like I've actually done all of these things, and people would normally never do that. Like some people would be even, find it difficult to even drive a car, like for everyday use. But I guess the thing about motorsports is like, it is about no fear. And it is about, embracing your limit, sort of going out of your comfort zone, and not being afraid of failure, because it's at failure where you learn what your limits are. And I think because I started doing that from such a young age, it was like that mindset was just ingrained in me to just find a different way to do it, because there are 100 million different ways to do something, right? You just have to find the one that works for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and kind of being diagnosed with something that late on, in some ways, that's a huge benefit to you, because you've already been dealing with it for long enough that you've found your path through it. Like you found your path through being able to play musical instruments. You found your path through to being able to drive. It's just maybe like those difficult points at the edges. Now you have an explanation for what's going on there, so you can appreciate where you're maybe struggling with this detail or that detail. But it's not something where it just, if you got it early on, it could have just put a hard stop to trying to move down that path in the first place.
Absolutely.
Well, and so driving is an interesting thing, because it's one of these, it's basically, it seems very simple. There's not very many controls. You don't really have to do a whole lot, it would seem. And it's something where generally people, as they get into it, like to learn to drive, kind of just like you said, for transportation, to get around. You spend a couple of days with somebody that can kind of guide you through what everything does. You get in the car, and usually very quickly you can be proficient enough to get around. But then when you talk about driving in motorsports, there's like layer upon layer upon layer of different levels of honing that technique and those skills to get to the point where you can actually become proficient, to become fast and whatnot. Is there a part that kind of pulled you back to motorsports where it was the challenge of trying to find more paths or more ways to like drive or get improve your driving, or was it something that you just enjoyed just as something, it's just fun to get behind the wheel, and was it just that pulled you back?
Yeah, I think it was like, it felt odd because it was like on the one hand, it was like, I definitely know I love this. I really appreciate cars. I love the beauty, the design, the differentiators between different brands. I love the sound of the engine, and I grew up with that, and also Formula One. Just also being here in the UK, like a fanatic fan, right? And if I'd been karting and doing really bad, like being at the back of the pack, I would have accepted that, this probably isn't my sport. But because I was getting podiums, I was like, well, then it's just there's I've got to figure out a way to like still be doing this, because I don't think it's that much of a limiting factor that I can't be here. So I think, for me, it was just like really failure is just not an option. And somehow I think, because of kind of understanding, when you're in motorsports, particularly at such a young age, like you do have to kind of grow up a lot faster because you're dealing with so many different things. And once I started studying it more as a business and understanding the business side of it, I think that's where I found my true passion for it. Because what I found more fascinating more than anything was the human performance side of it, and the fact that you've got teams and you've got drivers and you've got manufacturers and you've got all these people that are working towards one or two people's goal in a team, and getting all of those in synchronicity. Sort of, if we talk about Formula One, right, 20 or so races around the year, and none of these guys can lose their sort of peak performance at any point. And that's where I found my actual true, I think, calling within the sport, because I definitely enjoy driving. I definitely enjoy going on a racetrack, but what I love more is seeing other people take these lessons and transform their teams or their own leadership through the exploration of the sport. And of course, a lot of sports give you those lessons, but I think motorsport is so unique in the ways that it does it, particularly around technology. So I think it takes time. Like sometimes, you sort of maybe at childhood gravitate to something, and it's like that, that diagram that we've probably all seen, that like success doesn't just look like that. It's like all over the place. Right. And it's just finding, what is the role for you in that industry that really fulfills you and that you can be good at. Because also the other thing about motorsport, there's a lot of people who we know about in this podcast, is like it's crazy expensive. And even if you were, the most talented driver in the world, if you don't have millions of dollars, that your parents can put behind you, then it's super tough to make it. And obviously gender equality in the sport is still something that, we still don't have a female Formula One driver, right? So there's still a lot to be done, in terms of that as well.
There's a lot of difficult challenges there for sure. It's so interesting that you found the through line from music to motorsports into business, and then kind of went back from business into music and then back into motorsports.
Yeah. It's funny how life works, right?
Yes. Well, and so we have Jeanette with us, and Jeanette, believe it or not, she actually runs one of the racetracks here in Colorado, PPIR, Pikes Peak International Raceway. I mean, Jeanette, what do you think, just from what Farah was saying about like helping people realize their motorsports dreams versus actually pursuing the dreams of your own? Are there any parallels there where one can be as rewarding as the other, or does that help motivate you with what you're doing with the racetrack and such?
Absolutely. And just to throw it out there, Farah, you're a badass.
Thank you so much.
I think it's super cool. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to go sidetrack. You're podiuming at these races, and I don't fully understand the disability that you're discussing. But it's more than just mechanical. Racing takes a lot of mental endurance and mental grit, and being outside your comfort zone, and you hit in all those things when you're discussing that. So I think that's super, super cool. But no, absolutely. And I think when you find something that you're passionate about, it it doesn't have a choice whether or not it's in your life or not. It's in your life. It's there. It's stuck. So, and I think that when Farah was describing, like, she found her racing, she found her music, and then she found a career in business, but the passions never go away. Yeah. So you find a way to apply those skills and those grown-up skills and ways to make a living into your passions, because they're just not going to go away. So I think that does tie to the community 100%. You know, not all of us, I love to drive, but it feeds me to go to a race event and host it and have all these other people enjoy driving as well. So it's just because that's the passion. So absolutely, there's different. And if it wasn't for everybody who is contributing in different ways, you couldn't have a race event with only drivers. You need people who enjoy doing the analytical side, the timing side, the setup side, the course design side. You need all of that. And then to also put up with everybody and their personalities. It's a lot. And you need all those people to make the race scene happen. So totally.
Yeah, very cool. Well, and so Farah, is that kind of where the inspiration for Regents Racing came from? Or maybe can you talk a little bit about what the origins of Regents Racing was and kind of what you do with that?
Yeah, for sure. And just if I may, just really quickly, because Jeanette touched upon perhaps not understanding disability so much, I'll just quickly explain it in a nutshell, just in case anybody else listening to this podcast isn't aware, because a lot of people hear that term dyspraxia and they mistake it with dyslexia. And they're kind of like, if you have one, you may have the other. But like dyslexia is like a kind of issue with like sort of words, word formation, whereas dyspraxia is really around numbers, sequencing, coordination, balance, like that part of the brain that sends those signals to the rest of your body. That's where it struggles. So, you know, sometimes those children, they might seem quite clumsy. They are quite, you know, never that good at sport unless they really go for it. But particularly, obviously, you need a lot of balance and coordination to do those things. But yeah, so Regents Racing, yeah, it was kind of, you know, when you're like sort of 15 and you know, you're really starting to carve out, you know, who you are as an adult or as the adult you're going to become. And so 15 to 18 was really about, you know, studies and doing well and like making sure that, you know, I was going to get into a good university and everything. And funnily enough, like I took a gap year before university, and I did two things in that gap year that basically I'd say changed the course. Well, I guess allowed me to do what I'm doing today. First thing was I went to DJ school. And so the story sort of writes itself, because then in university I was just DJing all over London and all of those things. But secondly, I interned for Gumball 3000. And that to me opened up the whole like sport as a hospitality. You know, at that point I wasn't thinking about that. I was just like, just racer mentality, like it's just about the track, like there's the pure engineering behind something. But having the chance to be exposed to that, it showed me wow, like this whole thing is about communities. It's about, you know, road trips are just the most incredible way to like form a bond with someone, you know. And yeah, that really sort of inspired me. And then shortly after that, I went to university, and the university is called Regents University, hence the name of the company now is Regents Racing. But basically, I saw the chance to set up the Motorsport Society there because it didn't really exist. And at the same time, 90% of our students were international students. And so they didn't know the UK much, you know, so they didn't actually realize just how much beauty and how much heritage this country has with motorsports. And I just like absolutely had the best time, like showing these people, like, you know, the McLaren factory, or like, you know, going to like doing these drifting school experiences. There's so many different, you know, opportunities that you can kind of do here. And because I was studying business simultaneously, I started seeing in a deeper way, like these parallels of actual, you know, globalized businesses, and how like motorsports can actually have a lot of direct transferable lessons. So in essence, the concept was sort of born in university. We had a huge amount of success with it, because in the space of 3 years, we had 800 people who had experienced a Regents Racing event of some kind. And those events, again, you know, it'd be like even driving to like the Nürburgring, like doing European road trips. But I started going, I guess I love events, and I like to do things differently, and I love to explore things in all of the senses. So for me, you know, the reason that society became huge was because it was about the senses. It wasn't, you can be a fan of motorsport and not have to be always driving. So like we'd have people who'd come and we would take over like, you know, these beautiful museums, and we'd place like a dining table in the middle, and we'd have this whole sensorial experience, and to be surrounded by like these incredible cars as well. And so yeah, and then I guess after graduating, I did take a pause with it for a while, because I knew that this wasn't something that was just going to stay within university. Like, this was something that had the potential to be like to kind of grow, and I needed a few years to figure out how to make that happen. But also, in a way, my DJ sort of career was being pulled quite heavily, into that sort of path. And I toured the world for like pretty much 5 years straight, and just kind of had my chance of living the DJ life, and getting to play amazing music in different venues. But sort of towards my late 20s, I wanted to come back to Regents Racing. And at that point, also having evolved as a human being, and like also like in business as well, like, when in some ways, like when you're a DJ, like you're walking into so many different professional environments. Like, one day you could be DJing, like for me, I'd DJ at Buddha Bar, and then the next day I'd be DJing at a Formula One race, and you have to interact with so many different people. And like, I guess like my mind absorbs quite a lot, like very quickly in a short space of time. And I just kind of started seeing, different ways that like I could explore this ethos of Regents Racing and what it had started, and how to actually go much deeper into that, into the vision that I had. And so, yeah, about just a couple of years before the pandemic, I relaunched it. And essentially, we went deeper into the design of events. So we would do things that basically would just take you out of your comfort zone completely. So it could be like driving blindfolded with Land Rover, which is something that we've done many times. And, your trust is completely placed in your co-pilot. And so it's all about communication, and, tackling steep waters, hills, but like not being able to see anything. And so, yeah, just kind of designing these events that like, as much of it is a fun day out, but there's also like a deeper learning to it, and you come out of it, feeling like you've evolved somehow, and you've taken a risk. And a lot of people are afraid to go out of their comfort zone, and I think that's where I love that this community is about, challenging your limits, and seeing how motorsports can help you do that.
What's interesting to me is, in some ways, your being diagnosed with dyspraxia took you out of your comfort zone. Like when everything is normal and everything's fine, it's just like, well, I need to practice more, need to drive more. And then you find out, well, this normal path is probably not going to be open to you. So if you're going to do this thing, you have to think outside the box and find a new way to do this task that would be easy for somebody normally. And I wonder if finding that different path, thinking outside the box in that way, I mean, like what you're saying about being involved in motorsports, having a love of motorsports, but then applying that perspective to business, you're taking a different path, a path less traveled. Something, I mean, it totally makes sense when you describe it, but that's something like I never would have thought that like lessons from motorsports, from driving, from racing, from organizing a racing team would be directly applicable to a business. It's kind of like what you're describing with the blind driving with Land Rover. It's like you're kind of giving people a glimpse maybe into what your normal process is for some tasks, just thinking outside the box and pushing things in a different way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, I wouldn't change anything for the world, because I think in some ways, like, I think people who do have these kind of, sort of difficulties, they see the world in a very different way, and they process it differently. And you need people like that, because they think completely out of the box, and and hopefully they galvanize, whatever they might have been their cards dealt with, but then turned it to a totally different hand. And that creativity is of being constrained, sometimes can lead to really magnificent things.
Yeah. Well, and so Nigel, you've been quiet so far. So I wanted to bring Nigel on for this episode because he is a complete motorsports person. He's obsessed with driving fast and all that, but he's also obsessed with music, just like yourself. So kind of to both of you, I guess Nigel, maybe to you first. Do you think that there is a parallel in like when you have a passion like music or a passion like driving, does one feed the other? Are they related to one another, or what do you think?
I think absolutely. I mean, anytime you get an opportunity to chase a passion, you absolutely have to go for it. And I've been, lucky enough to be able to chase both of those passions. And so I also took a year off during college to go tour as a DJ. So I was very very lucky to go do that. And then now I'm, you know, building a race car and going racing and doing the driving thing. But I think you've got, there's so many like avenues to explore with when you have a passion like music or a passion like driving. I think that, you know, if you only have one thing that you're going for, it's still really valuable. But if you have two and you can interlink them and find ways to make them play off of each other, it adds so much depth to what you can achieve.
For sure. Well, and maybe Farah, for you, it sounded like your passion for music kind of took over when motorsports just didn't quite fit with your day to day, and then you found a way to bring it back in once you had more of a balance.
Yeah,
Would you agree with that?
It was like, you know, you know, for anyone listening who's at university, I mean, I really encourage you to kind of to explore like what are those interests, because it's such an amazing place or time in your life to make mistakes, to experiment, and start things. And I'm so grateful that I did that, because it left me with such a huge foundation of things. And because the society, you know, basically became a business, like, you know, we treated it like it was a business, you know. So I learned all of those really important skills like graphic design, building websites, like all of those things, right? But I guess it was for me, just when I graduated, just, you know, I got offered the chance to be a music journalist intern in Ibiza. And it was just like, I mean, you know, that's like the dream, you know, to spend 4 months on the island, you know, speaking to some of the best DJs in the world, and labels and stuff. So it was just, you know, for me, I was like, that makes sense. And why not just do that for a bit and see where it goes? But then I always kept my foot in the door with motorsport, because I had this, you know, incredible community, you know, 800 people, all of whom were around the world. So every time I was DJing somewhere, there's always a Regents racer somewhere. So always there was like this kind of networking opportunity, but also like we were quite lucky, because in the society we had like quite a few drivers who were professional. So we actually had somebody who got signed to Red Bull racing in the Middle East. We had a couple of Lamborghini Blanc Pond drivers. So like if I'd be like kind of DJing in LA or something, like they would always kind of like immerse me in their environments, or even book me as a DJ. Like there were a couple of times I was booked for the Formula One Abu Dhabi Grand Prix for people that were part of Regents Racing over there. And so I guess that was kind of like the perfect blend, because then I started DJing also for other brands as well, like Goodwood Festival of Speed. And I realized this was like a great way to kind of like, you know, be involved in motorsports and sort of have the DJ hat on as well. But I guess like, you know, after a few years, I was like, and also everybody kept saying like, oh, when's the next event? When's the next event? Because I kind of became known for kind of pulling these crazy events out of the bag. And I missed that. So yeah, it just took me a while to come back to it and figure out what's the right way to do this. Because when it's in university, it's kind of like, it's under that hat and it's just for those people. But obviously when it's for the wider public, it's a much bigger undertaking.
Sure.
So yeah.
Well, it almost seems like once you follow your passion, whatever that might be, and you actually have some success, or you start like really your life starts moving down that path, like there's something that is really rewarding about that. Like you realize it's something like, you know, that something that might be a small success for others is a huge success to you for that reason, because it really you're able to feed your passion every day. And then I think maybe, you know, if you've got two passions, you know, once you start moving down that road with one, you want to try and branch out into the other.
Absolutely. I think, you know, also that the world is like, people don't have to be so single focused on one thing. And I think even with Formula One, what you see is the entire thing is a cross industry collaboration. Like all the sponsors that get involved in Formula One, we're talking about, you know, technology groups, energy groups, you know, so many different sort of types of industries that benefit from that sort of moving R&D lab, because there isn't any other place like it for those companies. Right. And you see that like when you do merge or cross industries, you cross-pollinate things that like just, I guess, amplify or accelerate your own sort of vision or your mission. So I think, I think the world is also heading in that way where it isn't just about being constrained to one particular path. Like you can have multiple passions and just find a way to explore it. But I do think you need to be good at one thing first. I think, you do need to master your craft first before then moving on, right?
Yeah. Well, and so kind of related to that, but changing gears just ever so slightly. So, Farah, if I'm understanding right, there's another passion that you had that kind of fed into both of these things, which was video games. Or am I correct in that?
Well, I was a gamer growing up. Yeah, I've had to sort of stop gaming just because it takes up too much time. But I was a massive gamer growing up.
Well, and so what I'm wondering about, like specifically, is driving games. I think. I know that a lot of us here, Gran Turismo is what hooked us.
Yes.
Was that similar, a similar circumstance for yourself?
100%. Yeah, it was Gran Turismo all the way, PS1 back in the day, for sure.
Well, and what's wondering, what's one thing I've been thinking about, and you kind of touched on it back at the very beginning about motorsports. I mean, motorsports is an expensive pursuit, and each level up, it becomes more and more expensive. And so it's something where unless you have a whole lot of resources at your disposal, you can very easily hit a plateau where, if you wanted to get that next seat in that next level up of racing, but you don't have the financial wherewithal to do so, then that can be a limitation. That can be an obstacle that you run into. But probably in the last, I don't know, 5-7 years, like Gran Turismo, video games, driving simulators, and now with the birth of esports, things have really changed in that arena. And I wanted to see, just what you thought and everybody else about, like, is that a viable path now to like either get you into motorsports or like could it be its own pursuit in and of itself?
Yeah, I think, it's definitely becoming its own thing, right? Its own identity. Brands are being formed just purely for esports. And I think the pandemic really accelerated motorsports, and particularly in the esports landscape. And I think it's a great, it's so exciting, like to think what are the options, even, as a gamer back then, like to have like what you can have today at like, an entry level price is like, it's so exciting. And I think you can learn quite a few things. Obviously you do need to drive at the same time, like in real life, but I think it's a fantastic, way into the industry. And with the amount of money that's being put through with brands now, to develop some of these, Nismo driving academy kind of drivers who've won particular competitions, I think it's great. And I think also, it can, for me, what I loved about gaming, of course, it's addictive and it's really fun, but it's actually something that really developed my coordination skills much more, because obviously it's all about reaction and coordination. So,
yeah. Well, Nigel, what do you think? What do you think is the current state of like gaming, esports, driving simulators, that sort of thing?
I think it's become like a viable path to get more people into at least like closer to motorsport. I mean, playing Gran Turismo back on like PlayStation 1, like that's definitely that's how I started also, and it's what fuels that fire. But I think now with like things being more realistic and you can get more advanced, like actual simulations, you can get a lot closer to the realistic feeling of driving and the experience of an entire race or even like a weekend. Like even the Formula One games have you doing interviews and you have to like do the PR side of it. Which is really interesting. So there's definitely a lot more like avenue towards getting closer to the sport itself, as well as like esports. I mean, that's a thing on its own. If you want to be a professional esports racer, that is now a career that you can have.
Yeah, there's a lot of professional teams that like McLaren, Ferrari, they have their own esports teams now.
Mm-hmm. You don't have to move into real racing anymore to be a professional driver. You can do it virtually.
Jeanette, what do you think? Were you ever interested in any of this, or?
Well, I mean, I was a gamer kid, but I was never. We all know by now. I got a late start in the car scene. I started driving when I was like 27, maybe my first autocross. So my gaming was very much real time strategy and RPG, and just not car related at all. So, but it's still. I mean, Nigel said it. It creates access. And the video game world is a world that you can be passionate about, just like you can be passionate about music and motorsports. So even if you're not doing the esports driver, you could still be very involved in the production of video games or the creativity of the video games or the artistic side of it. Because, I mean, you play Forza, these cars are beautiful, you know, and the way that they replicate them. So it's a way to be building up the industry and the community without even necessarily being the driver. And you can do it from your home. It does create that access. And I mean, we barely mentioned gender equality and financing earlier, and same things. Like, it doesn't matter what gender you are, and it really doesn't matter as much how much money you have. You can get involved when it's esports.
And that's actually one of the questions that I wanted to ask about, like the rise in esports, the rise in computer gaming. With that, there is something that comes with that, which is anonymity. I mean, you just have a username. So it's problematic, I will say. I mean, that they're like all of these different rooms are like being randomly put into groups to do like online racing and stuff like that. I mean, you don't know who you're getting, but in some ways that could be a benefit because you can really like excel just purely on merit of your ability to kind of rise up through those ranks. So, I mean, do you think that that's what the appeal to me is about like these new driving games, driving simulators, is that it takes away the barrier of entry, so you can compete in pretty much whatever level you want to, and anybody can do it, and you have no idea who you're racing against, and so you're just really kind of racing against somebody just based more or less purely on the merit of their skill.
It does make it easier once you put that helmet on. You're a driver. You're not a woman or a man or whatever. So it does make it easier to live that in a way, even though you're not physically putting on a helmet. No one actually sees what your face looks like unless you want them to.
Yeah. What I would hope, and that would be cool, is at some point somebody just like, oh, so and so, this is like one of the top racers, and it turns out like, oh, it's this woman that has come up through the ranks. Like now, like it just opens maybe a door that wouldn't normally have opened.
Yeah, totally.
I don't know. What do you think, Farah? Is that the way things are going, or is there a chance of that happening? Or
yeah, I mean,
is that a pipe dream?
Yeah, I think, you know, as you said, you know, a lot of brands are putting quite a lot of money into this now. So there is an end point, you know, for somebody who's gaming, ultimately to potentially kind of be involved in a deeper way. Also, though, it is exciting when you see like, you know, your Formula One drivers kind of doing the gaming thing, like. You know, they're kind of that you can be known as a gamer as well. Like everyone knows Lando is like a phenomenal gamer, and Charles, and you know, it's quite cool to see even the pros like take it on and how they would fare against others. So yeah, I think, you know, as you guys were saying, like this is literally a career now, and as you were saying, Jeanette, as well, like it's opened up, you know, more roles that didn't exist, you know, 20 years ago about being a video game designer for a racing game, right, or a graphics designer or something like that. So I think it's fantastic. It's definitely that barrier to entry which needs to be addressed in motorsport, because at the end of the day, it's not a sport like football where you can just pick up a ball, go to the garden and kick a ball and get pretty good, right? Like the barriers to entry in motorsport, they need to be you know, changed. So I think this is a great way of doing it.
Yeah. Well, and kind of related to the barrier of entry, one of the other questions that I wanted to throw out there is, you know, so Farah, you have a really interesting interview with the founder of the W Series, women's only racing series, Catherine Von Meer. And one of the points that she made there is that she wanted basically to reduce any possible barrier of entry for anybody that could compete in that series. And so basically that levels the playing field, and that the brilliant part of that, in fact, like the details for people that are listening or watching, and if you are not familiar with all of the rules and the setup for the W Series, it's actually a pretty fascinating way to set up any racing series. It just happens to be that she did it for women to get into racing. So you should definitely listen to that episode and check it out. But it basically is fully pitting driver against driver. There's really minimal, if any, advantage from one car to the next. In fact, there's rotation of the drivers, so that there really can't be, somebody gets this car and that has an advantage, and then that's what pushes them up to the top 10 because next race maybe somebody else is sitting in that car. So that it really levels the playing field. When it comes to motorsports, do you think that is the purest form of motorsports, where it's just driver pitted against driver and there's minimal or not as many benefits mechanically, or is the mechanical development something that also is part of it, just maybe on a different level?
I mean, it's a great question. I think, Formula One has been struggling with this. At what point is it about the advanced engineering and that should be the central focus, or is it about, trying to level the playing field? But then you see, like, obviously in the last few years, just how crazy the gap was between how much a company like Mercedes will spend and then the back of the pack. And then it isn't really about the best driver at all. It's you can't compete with someone who's putting 300 million pounds more than you in your car, right? So and I think that's why a lot of F1 drivers, again, when you ask them what your best times in motorsport, they'll go back to karting, because that is the most purest form of equal car, it's just such a thrill going karting, right? But the W series, I think, a fantastic design of taking away the things that were wrong with particular series and championships and just making it about the driver, because it is about talent. And I think that line just needs to be like that. There is a line that sort of, and I'm not sure how much fans care about all the advanced engineering. That there'll be a portion of fans, but it's, I think, more of a niche as opposed to your everyday person. I think they are more driven by the personality of the driver, what they've achieved, who they're racing for, versus the ins and outs of the specs of the car. But that's my sort of 2 cents on it, I think.
Jeanette, what do you think? What is the pure sense of racing?
I think, there's room for all of it in all the different series and different, because the engineering and the mechanical side of it is obviously a really, really fun part to be competitive about. But it does create a problem, especially on this high end when there's access to so much money. The cool thing about, and I did listen to that podcast, which was amazing. I thought it was great. It was very inspirational. But the cool thing about doing that and making it about the driver, I kind of lost my train of thought for a second. Hold on.
We can come back to Jeanette.
Yeah, we might have to, because I had a thought and then I got distracted by it.
Let me pick Nigel's brain on it. What do you think, Nigel? What is that? What do you think of that?
I love it. I've always felt like Formula One is really, I've always loved the technological advancement in Formula One and seeing all this technology that ends up like getting banned or something. But I've always felt like that's a little bit more car development focused than specifically who is the best individual driver. Because my favorite Formula One races are the ones that happen in the rain, because everybody's like, oh, rain's the great equalizer, whatever. That's when you get to see a little bit more the drivers who shine. And you see through a little bit of the technology differences between the teams. But also there's a part of racing where every single driver wants to win and everybody wants to have a competitive advantage. So even if you go down to, all the way down to karting, and everybody's got a very similar kart, like chassis wise, everybody's running a same spec, like sealed motor. Everybody wants to have some kind of advantage. They're going to find something like, it's how they came up with tire blankets, right? Like some kind of advantage to win. And so I don't know. I don't think you can ever.
It's hard to separate the two.
It's really difficult to separate the two, but I love the idea. I love that, like the idea that, it's not about the car, it's fully about the driver. And that to me is what makes for really amazing racing on track.
Yeah. Right, Jeanette.
I do remember. Thank you.
Go for it.
So,
yes.
One of the barriers with motorsports industry nowadays is the fan base and trying to keep them engaged. And when NASCAR was kind of in their heyday, and they still have a huge fan base, the fans followed the drivers. It was all about the driver's story, and we talk about that before on this podcast. So when you remove the car development, sometimes some of these cars, these super race cars, they kind of overshadow the driver, and it's more about the car and the manufacturer and their stories. When you create the equal playing field, you can actually focus on the driver again. And I feel like when you have that person engagement, when you have someone that you can look up to, that's more creating that fan base. So that's what's really exciting about the W series, is that it doesn't just have to be women. They can grow into more things, and it's kind of create an opportunity of people getting into watching racing again. It has a very successful fan base all on its own, and I think that's awesome.
What's funny, what that brings to mind, Jeanette, is the Drive to Win series on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
So Farah, over there in Europe, I mean, Formula One has always been a big deal. Here in the US, not so much, not for nearly as long a period of time. Some of us have followed it for a long time, but it really has been on the fringes. But then all of a sudden, when this series comes out, that all of a sudden tells all of the stories behind the racing. Like, the racing is part of it, but there's so much of a story behind every driver in every race. Once that curtain was lifted, all of a sudden, this huge influx of new people got really interested in Formula One. So maybe that's the hidden side, or the other side of racing, is that there's just so many good stories involved in it.
Yeah, I think the Netflix thing was, phenomenal. I think this is the right stat, but I read something crazy that like this Drive to Survive thing basically got about 70 million new fans into the sport, which is absolutely incredible. It's just the power of Netflix, right? And I think, again, Formula One, one of the struggles they were facing was like, a kind of getting the new generation into the sport that's going to live and grow with the sport and enable the sport to thrive and continue. So, and I think people like, don't realize all of those hidden extra things that go on behind the scenes, because prior to a few years ago when Bernie was running the sport, like that, this level of access wasn't there. I mean, I think after he left, I heard something crazy, like they didn't even have like a marketing department or something. So things like podcasts, like all these ways of like getting so much more in-depth like knowledge, they just weren't there. So how can a fan have that relationship with that driver if all of those points of media isn't constantly being fed through the machine, right? So yeah, I love that Drive to Survive show, and yeah, very much looking forward to next season. This year, this F1 championship has been so crazy that it's going to be so exciting to see what comes out on Netflix.
Yeah, it's going to be wild for sure. Well, and so let me ask you about another series. So Farah, forgive me, but you just posted up something that you got to interact or tour one of the Formula E teams, or go to one of their garages. What do you think? What do you think of what Formula E is and what they're doing as far as it's kind of like the W Series. It's a different model, a different formula, but it's still racing. But it seems like it's a very forward-thinking model that might be like that like what Formula E is doing, that could be the direction that a lot of motorsports ends up going in, just because of basically focusing on like something that is more sustainable, more renewable, more environmentally friendly. But they also have, excuse me, they've really kind of packaged an interesting way to structure a race series around it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And the story of how the Formula E series got conceptualized and everything is also extremely fascinating as well. So anyone who hasn't heard about it, definitely listen to podcasts with Alejandro Agag, who started the series, but he literally risked everything to start this thing, and nobody thought it would work. But here we are sort of quite a few years later. I think there has to be at some point, perhaps maybe a merge between Formula One and Formula E, particularly around the technology, because that's the way that the world's heading. And it is interesting how Formula E is designed like this fan boost thing. But I mean, me personally, like I don't have that much time to kind of, get so integrated in it and watch it every weekend. Because obviously just even Formula One in itself is, it's more than half a year, right? It's quite consuming. But I think in terms of like what it's doing for the world is you need places like that where you can literally test technology to its absolute limits for it to then create wider good for the world, because the sort of breakthroughs in energy, as you said, in sustainable fuels, like this is the place where all of this stuff happens. That is like so important. So I think, it's interesting. It will be interesting to see where does Formula E and Formula One, like how do they coexist together, and like what and what kind of gets transferred. And obviously they're owned by the same governing body. So,
right.
Yeah.
They might be kept separate, but I mean, it seems like maybe a merge could be possible down the road, 5-10 years down the road.
And also it's like,
just generally,
just to touch on one thing other as well, it's a place where like, obviously to get into Formula One seat is so difficult, and that the thing is like that's just another series where if you're waiting to get that seat, you can go there and like and still like do what you need to do, get super license points, get the experience, and then potentially move over to Formula One. And there are a few drivers who've kind of done that, or the other way around, when they've left Formula One, they've gone into Formula E.
Well, and maybe just as kind of we're getting towards the tail end here, what do you think of the move towards electric motors or electric cars, just in general? Maybe just throw it out there to anybody. Is it a merger? Is it kind of like a merger of like these games and these simulators where all of a sudden now you're driving like potentially a car that would behave literally exactly like it would be in the game? Or is it something where I personally am still having a hard time wrapping my head around it, but I understand from a technology standpoint, like once we really move in that direction, it should be pretty amazing what an electric car or a car that's driven by electric motors can do compared to a gasoline engine car.
I mean, like I'm still a purist. So, for me, just that feeling of the vibration of a car and like the smell of petrol and like all of those things, it's like, it's so, I don't know, I just love it. And I mean, like for me personally, like I would purchase an electric car, to kind of get around, but I would want to be racing in a fully fledged, petrol or hybrid perhaps engine. But obviously it is the future, and that's just the way the world is going, right? And when you have governments that are making these, mandatory, particularly around the production of vehicles, it's kind of like that's just where it's going, and totally understand why. But I really hope that the identity of what it was will still kind of continue through, and that we will be able to kind of go to a track and race, your Porsche and it be like not the electric kind of version, and kids will grow up wanting that experience, because again, like so sad how manual transmission is just something that a lot of people nowadays don't drive, and they'll just do Tiptronic. So I think these are just some of the things right there just fading out as we kind of grow. But yeah, I don't know, I'm a purist, so
yeah. What do you think, Jeanette? Are you eager to move to that next phase?
No, not at all. I think a lot of us are resistant to it, but I think it's just accepting that it's there. And I'm kind of more of an observer stance at this point, just to see how it does change things culturally and competitively. And then this is not maybe the easiest comparison, but I was an English lit major in college. And at that time, that's when all the ebooks came out and digital print. Yeah. And it was one of those things where that's used to scare writers, and like, because books is like how they made their money in the production of it. And someone said, like, no one's ever going to want to let go of the feeling of holding a book. And I mean, I kind of feel like books have made a comeback. Like, I feel like more people read books than they do digital print. So it's not the exact same comparison to cars, but I feel like sometimes you can't. There's a timelessness to some of these vehicles. And I just don't think that people are going to let them go completely. I think that, I think sure. We still have manuals. Me and Nigel both drive manuals. You know what I mean? So, yes. Yeah, hopeful.
I think there will always be like something to throw back or to harken back to, as far as like, classic cars. Like we might be driving classic cars right now. It's going to take us 20 years to realize it. Exactly.
Yeah, totally.
What do you think, Nigel? Are you excited for this next phase?
I'm kind of torn. I'm split between being like a purist and loving all the sensations and driving a manual car. And also I'm really excited to see like how that technology can make things better. So like I have two different setups when I DJ. I have turntables and I play all vinyl, or I have the new, MIDI triggered all in one box setup. And I love both of them for very different reasons. So I think the same thing is going to kind of go for racing. Like electric cars have so many different like advances with them, but you know, shifting through a manual car, like I got to drive like a vintage Spitfire at the racetrack. Has like no horsepower. It's not like the most exciting car. It's not the most fast car, but it feels awesome. And you get out to drive it, you're just rolling through the gears and like feeling every single raw sensation is amazing.
Yeah.
So I'm completely split.
There's going to be a draw for the analog cars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, so as we're winding down here, maybe Farah, just what is on your agenda? What is your next 6 months or a year looking like? What are you looking forward to that you have coming up?
Sure. Yeah. Of course, it's been, really tough for both industries, music and motorsport. So the last, year and a half has been total switch of gears. My business did get affected because, again, obviously motorsports events are very face-to-face. It's not something you can replicate on Zoom. And so I'm really looking forward to now, like, I think things are easing up a little bit, and obviously the vaccine and everything. So like, hopefully we're just getting back to life with those things, because they've been a little bit on pause as a result. Even DJing, like, I mean, I guess people now like haven't been out for so long that they really want to go out. So like this summer, I've had 2 or 3 gigs that were like 13 hours straight, which was absolutely nuts. But I think, yeah, like this, you mentioned earlier, I'm a podcast host as well. And I've really loved the whole podcast journey. So that's something we're continuing to grow. Season 3 of my podcast Mission Makers is coming out in the autumn. And we actually do have a Formula One driver launching the show with us.
Very cool.
So that's really exciting. Just the chance to like talk to people, who are sort of doing crazy things in the world, like Catherine. And we've got someone coming on the show as well who's literally right now working on flying cars. And he says that that's something we will see very soon within our lifetime, which I'm really excited to kind of hear about. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And just, also with music, I'm producing quite a lot. So hopefully going to be releasing some EPs, and then just getting back to Regents Racing really. And, kind of just getting some more events in the bag and getting to meet.
Very cool. Excellent. Well, we have taken a lot of your time, and thank you very much for sitting down and chatting with us. It's been a pleasure, and we'll have to do it again sometime here soon.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been so nice speaking with you guys. We talked about quite a lot of different things.
Yes.
And yeah, definitely any time. And yeah, have a lovely rest of the day wherever you're listening to this.
Yes. Who knows what side or what continent you might be on. Yes. Well, thank you very much for joining us, everybody. If you've made it to the end, really appreciate your listening. Really appreciate your support. And until next time, stay tuned as always with Flatirons Tuning.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatirons.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.